everyone, and welcome to the first day of the National Children's Campaign's Convention Week events. My name is Jonah Gottlieb, and I'm the co-founder and executive director of the National Children's Campaign. And thank you all so much for tuning in, those on Facebook, those on Twitch, and those on YouTube. Welcome. We're so excited today to kick off our whole week of events. We have events every single day at 4:30 Eastern, 1:30 Pacific, talking about why we need a president for kids and some of the many issues that are facing young people in our country right now. So just a quick overview. Today we have an awesome event on the U.S. Department of Children and Families. Tomorrow we have a webinar on reopening schools. Wednesday is child immigration. Thursday is workers and their families. And Friday is environmental justice and the Flint water crisis. Every single event starts at 4:30 Eastern, 1:30 Pacific, right here on the National Children's Campaign's Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch pages. So please tune in. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our amazing moderators and organizers for today's events, Rani and Lana. So take it away, guys.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to an event on why we need a U.S. Department of Children and Youth. Keep in mind that the participation of speakers today does not indicate an official endorsement from the speakers or their affiliated organizations for the creation of this department. They are here today to provide insight on their areas of expertise and how that informs this week's theme of why we need a president for kids.
We are so excited to hear from featured speakers Zanagee Artis, Daphne Frias, Barbara J. Poppe, as well as additional video messages from the Human Rights Campaign and Marianne Williamson.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lana Weidgena. I am based in Baltimore, Maryland. I'm 21 years old, and I am the Outreach Director at National Children's Campaign.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rani Chor. I'm 16 years old, based in Los Angeles, California, and I am the Graphics Director at the National Children's Campaign. Here is a video from Marianne Williamson, who was a candidate for the 2020 presidential election and who is a best-selling author and political activist. She was unable to join us today due to a recent surgery, but as a champion for the U.S. Department for Children and Youth, this is what she has to say.
We need a United States Department of Children and Youth. Every single school, every public school in the United States should be a palace of learning and culture and the arts. That is our greatest treasure, our children. And if you want to have an amazingly prosperous economy 10 years from now, what you do is take better care of your 10-year-olds today. We need to end this immoral way that we primarily base our educational funding on property taxes. That's wrong. The great entrepreneurial genius of this country lies in the brain of every kindergartner in every neighborhood in America. I want a massive realignment of investment in the direction of America's children. The vulnerabilities and the challenges of millions of American children today is so beyond anything that we're even talking about within the political establishment, and this is wrong. They have simply normalized the despair of millions of American children. Why? Because these children are not old enough to vote, so they're not a constituency. They're not old enough to work, so they don't wield any financial leverage. So how can they compete with all the corporate money that floods Washington? But as President of the United States, I will make sure that we rescue these children. We will rescue them no differently than if they were the victims of a natural disaster. We will recognize that millions of American children, 13 million, are hungry. 100,000 American children are homeless. We have millions of American children who, according to psychologists, are experiencing a level of PTSD, which is no less severe than the PTSD of a returning veteran from Afghanistan and Iraq. We need trauma-informed education. We need community wraparound services. We need restorative justice. We need conflict resolutions. We need mental health services for these children and for their families. And we need mindfulness in the schools.
Now we will hear from our first featured speaker who will speak on the topics of youth, climate, and food, Zanagee Artis. Zanagee is a 20-year-old from Clinton, Connecticut, and a co-founder of the youth climate justice organization Zero Hour. As director of logistics, he organized the Zero Hour Youth Climate March in Washington, D.C. in 2018 and helped to coordinate the marches globally. Since then, alongside fellow Zero Hour organizers, he organized This is Zero Hour, the Youth Climate Summit in Miami, Florida in July 2019, and the Global Climate Strikes in Providence, Rhode Island with the Sunrise Movement last September. Zanagee has also led the effort to establish Zero Hour's international climate justice education campaign, Getting to the Roots of Climate Change, and he is now leading the Vote for Our Future campaign for Zero Hour as Director of Advocacy. Welcome, Zanagee. We're so excited to hear from you.
Hello, I'm so excited to be here and have this important conversation about why we need a U.S. Department of Children and Youth. And so I'll just start a bit about Zero Hour and why we started that. And for me, I was not able to vote at the time. And Zero Hour was a way, it was an avenue for young people to channel energy into political organizing and climate justice work, even if they didn't have the ability to vote yet. And so that's what we did with our Youth Climate March in 2018, is we wanted to call attention to young people and the intense amount of work that young people are doing around climate justice, because climate change is going to disproportionately impact our futures the most. And so what can this department do for environmental justice? And what does that mean for young people? Well, you may be thinking we already have the Environmental Protections Agency, the EPA, and they do all this work around environmental protections, addressing pollution, not as much as in this current administration right now, but historically the EPA has been a bastion of environmental work in the US. But with a Department of Children and Youth, we would have officials in government who are specifically examining the impacts of climate change and pollution on young people, and ensuring that young people whose futures are ahead of us and who climate change will impact the most are catered to in decision-making processes and policy decisions related to the environment. And so some examples of issues that are acutely impacting youth more than any other group include lead poisoning, air pollution, which can lead to increased incidences of asthma in youth, access to nature for kids, access to nutrition, and that's just to name a few. And we've seen the disproportionate impact on kids during the coronavirus pandemic. And when kids left schools, they transitioned to remote learning. We saw this huge problem with access to nutrition and meals in public schools. So many kids around the country are relying on their public schools for access to health and nutrition in the form of school meals. And why is that? That should not be the case. And that's clearly a problem, but who is in government working on that specifically? Right now, it doesn't look like that anyone is specifically catering action around the impact of major issues. It could be climate change, it could be the pandemic around kids. And then I also want to talk about the Green New Deal. In the youth climate justice movement, the Green New Deal has been a catalyst for organizing, and it's been this beacon of hope for young people who are organizing around this ideal of a future with a Green New Deal. And what could that transition look like for sustainable energy and the job market and students graduating from college, leaving into an economy that is so badly impacted by the pandemic? And so again, we'd have the EPA and we have elected officials who can pass Green New Deal legislation. But what about those people who can't vote for their elected officials who will pass a Green New Deal? And what about once the Green New Deal does get passed? How are we ensuring that young people are included throughout that policy process and that the impacts on kids are actually followed through on, and that we are catering to and listening to feedback from young people whose are not constituents, like Marianne Williams said. And we need people in government who are specifically catering to young people. And then a final issue is voting, right? And 0 Hour and the National Children's Campaign right now are working on the hashtag Vote for Our Future campaign to get young people engaged in this election, because historically, young people are the demographic that votes the least in our country. But why is it that young organizers have this burden to get out the vote, to encourage other young people to vote, to get them the information they actually need to be able to register, to get their mail-in ballot? This is something that government should be doing. If they really want voter participation, they will institute policies and practices and new offices that are catering toward young people. And so we're hoping that this does happen and that will increase voter engagement. But we have yet to see a major effort by the government to include young people in improving voting. And so I just want to close out with saying why we need a president for kids. The kids in the US are our future. We are organizing for our future. We are fighting for that. We are encouraging other young people to get involved in politics. But we need a president who, once we do get them elected, is actually going to continue on those promises that they've made to this country's youth, make good on those promises to improve our economy and our future, address climate change, make our livelihoods something that is better for in this country. It's clear that there is a massive lack of equity in education, in access to healthcare, access to nutrition, and impacts related to environmental justice. And we need to elect someone as president who will take lead on these issues for kids. So thank you all so much for tuning into this event. And I hope you'll join us in this fight for a Department of Children and Youth.
Thank you so much, Zanagee. It was wonderful to hear from you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Next, we'll be hearing from Daphne Frias.
All right. So Daphne Frias is a 22-year-old Latina. She got her start shortly after the Parkland shooting by busing more than 100 students from her college campus to the nearest March for Our Lives event. In August of 2019, she was appointed as the New York State Director for March for Our Lives. Having cerebral palsy and using a wheelchair, she is fiercely proud to be a loud champion for the disabled community. We are so glad to have you here today, Daphne.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be a part of this super important discussion. So what I really wanted to talk about today, obviously, as Ronnie mentioned, I have a disability. I have cerebral palsy. I use a wheelchair to navigate and zoom around life. And I wanted to shed some awareness about what living with a disability looks like and how young people with disabilities primarily are affected, and how U.S. Department of Children and Youth could really help make sure that equitable advocacy is uh, sort of shared to us in terms of young people with disabilities. Um, a major issue that I've come across is over the last month or so, we've celebrated the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and this act was a comprehensive piece of legislation that passed several equality acts on all levels for individuals with disabilities in terms of architecture, infrastructure, education, social security benefits, healthcare. And while that piece of legislation was incredibly important, it did do a lot to make sure that people with disabilities were allowed to thrive and flourish within our environment. There's still so much more to go in terms of making sure that young people receive the um, same shot in our society as adults with disabilities do. Oftentimes, young people with disabilities, as they navigate through the education system, are often not receiving the same amount of resources as individuals and students without disabilities. Oftentimes, because special education divisions in public schools are underfunded by the government. There's also a lack of training to our teaching professionals as to how to deal with various physical and emotional disabilities. So oftentimes this leads to isolation and harsh punishment to those with disabilities in terms of finding ways to mediate escalating situations that may happen within the classroom. And this is really detrimental to young people with disabilities as it rips them away from an educational system that can help elevate them out of some of the oppressive systems that we face within our society with disabilities. Oftentimes, we already face great challenges in finding equitable employment. Oftentimes, we see that many employers are considered equal opportunity employers, which means that they don't legally discriminate against individuals with disabilities. But oftentimes, in going in for an interview or meeting in person with your potential future employer, discrimination is brought upon due to various educational setbacks, maybe verbal differences in communication, or even physical limitations that someone with disability may have. And I really believe that if we championed for a U.S. Department of Children and Youth, there would be a sector dedicated to young people with disabilities to make sure that the injustices like um, employment inequity and education injustice would be less prominent. It's also incredibly important that we talk about how the pandemic has affected young people. Originally, as we were first learning about the pandemic, it was sort of widely stated that the pandemic was not going to be affecting young people as strongly as it was the elderly and immunocompromised. And I'm coming to you all here today about 3 months after recovering from a 31-day long battle from COVID-19. And as Ronnie mentioned, I'm only 22 years old. If you go by varying statistics and common used statings, someone my age shouldn't have had such a long and difficult battle with COVID, but here I am still struggling with sort of long haul COVID syndrome after all this time. And I don't think that there has been enough emphasis on the mental impact of the pandemic and how it has affected young people. Young people are living in homes where they're seeing their parents be continuously pressured and stressed on sort of how to keep households running, and things of that nature. And young people being in that environment with their families can often lead to sort of projected anxiety and stress on us. And with the varying educational plans that have been laid out since schools have begun to reopen across the country, being that there isn't one sort of uniform way that schools are returning to session, it can be very stressful for students. And it has also showed a glaring disproportion in education access and technology access, as students in low income and Black and Brown communities often don't have access to technology or Wi-Fi to even be able to continue their education virtually. And I believe that these disparities really exist because, as Zanagee stated, and as we heard Marianne speak about in her video, there isn't really a federal governing body that is really advocating on behalf of the voice of young people. And over the past couple of years, we've seen young people, especially Gen Z, do amazing things in terms of gun violence prevention advocacy, climate advocacy, healthcare and reproductive justice, almost any issue that you can think of. But we've had to resort to measures of physical mobilization and really begging for our lives and justice on behalf of our generation, because there isn't a way for our voice to be equitably included within our government and our justice system. So I truly believe that if we were able to upon the creation of this department, we'd really be able to tap into not only ending the disparities amongst young people, but also giving them a way and a vehicle in which their voices can be amplified for the better good of not just our generation, but for everyone on this planet and in this country, because Gen Z has some of the most, innovative and amazing ways that we've adapted to overcoming various systems of oppression and various environmental factors that we're dealing with currently. And if given the opportunity, I believe that young people could really help steer our path forward to a greater future, which is why I'm so happy to be having this discussion with you. And something that I want to leave as a final note is really any young person out there who is sort of feeling dismayed about the current situation that we're in, continue to use your voice and advocate for things that you care about. We're currently in a DNC convention week. Take time to listen in on some of the amazing speakers that are going to be speaking at the DNC. Educate yourself about the platforms that are being put out there. And if you're an eligible voter this election season, please go out and cast your ballot, because that's one step closer to making sure that young people's voice is heard in the way that our government is run. And if you're ineligible to vote, your voice still matters regardless. Make sure that people around you who matter to you are keeping your thoughts in mind when they're going to the polls. Make sure that the community around you is educated, so that even if you can't vote, you can still help direct your community's future towards a place where you feel it should be, because everyone's voice matters, especially the voice of young people. So thank you so much for having me, and I'm so glad to have been a part of this discussion.
Thank you so much, Daphne. We really appreciate you sharing your experiences and speaking with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next up, we will be hearing a message from the Human Rights Campaign about child immigration.
It's a denial of children's humanity to say that because they were born in difficult or a dangerous place at the wrong time, that they don't deserve a second chance. That they shouldn't ask for refuge. How many more children are we willing to subject to a lifetime of pain? Once my family was taken, I became fully aware that my community matters less to some people. That we are treated differently because of the color of our skin or where our parents were born. But we are now in a moment where we can no longer be blind to the blatant disregard of human life. We're not backing down. We're not backing down. This time, the stakes are too visible, too well documented to be ignored. It has reached you. It has reached all of us and forced us to ask ourselves, what kind of country do we want to be? One that violates the rights of children, including the fundamental right to seek asylum? Or do we want to be an America that values children and families and the freedom to be who we are? I have to believe that this is an opportunity for us to rise above the tyranny, the ignorance, the malpractice, and believe in change. This is a chance for us to come together as a nation and rise above division and fear. Only then can we stop the division of families and stop the policies that place children in cages. So for our families and children, let us march and make our voices heard. Remember this in November. When we march to the polls, remember our anger, the outrage, and the desire to act. Remember in November that the end to these cruel policies starts with us.
Thank you so much for that message. I think that's really important and a really inspiring video. Next up, we're going to be hearing from Barbara Poppe. Barbara is a nationally recognized leader who served as the Obama Executive Director of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. She developed and launched the first ever federal strategic plan to end homelessness. Barbara Poppe is the founder of Barbara Poppe and Associates, a diverse group of experts that can be mobilized to help communities solve their toughest challenges. Working at a local level, she led the Community Shelter Board in Columbus, Ohio, a public-private partnership that operated as a backbone organization to address homelessness. We're going to be hearing from her specifically on the issue of youth homelessness. Welcome, Barbara.
Hi, it's great to be with you all. Thank you for having me today. I wanted to talk with you a little bit about homelessness as it impacts youth, but also children. I left USICH in 2014 after having worked for President Obama. And since then, I've been working across the country, helping state and local leaders better address homelessness. And I want to say it's been an honor to be on this call and hear all of the inspirations and your aspirations for what you're hoping to achieve as young people in our country. So thank you for that energy. I just want to start off first by kind of framing the issue of homelessness. There's a lot of media coverage, but it's often not very fair coverage and makes homelessness seem as if it's something that happens to other people rather than everyday people living in our country. Homelessness at its core means that someone does not have a home. They don't have an apartment. They don't have a safe place for them to sleep and go about their everyday business. We know that that lack of home is really impacted by structural racism. That structural racism causes people to have lack of access to not only housing, but also to employment. Black women with children are more likely to be evicted than any other type of household composition. We know that there's a strong connection to incarceration. And again, there's racial disparities in who is being jailed and put in prison. Homelessness also directly ties to the extreme income inequality in our country that stems from low wages and limited family benefits to support and care for children, youth, and their families. There also has been long-term underinvestment in the housing supply and the subsidies. Long before you were born, and 40 years ago, we saw adequate federal investment, and that has gone away. And so we've lost housing supply. The cost of housing exceeds wages, and more people are at risk of homelessness. Homelessness also comes about because there's other forms of discrimination in addition to racial discrimination. Families with children experience a lot of discrimination in the rental market. People who are LGBTQIA are also frequently discriminated or tossed out of their housing. Immigrants and asylees are often unable to find a safe place to be in our country. People with disabilities are disproportionately experiencing homelessness. And we know under COVID, it's really laid bare all of these issues, and that it's further compounded by the digital divide, which impacts access to education, work, and benefits. So all around, homelessness is a unfortunately growing problem in our country that impacts millions of Americans each year. We know the solution to homelessness, and that is people have a decent place to live. When you have a decent place to live, it's much easier to have access to health, to education. A place to live provides a platform for opportunity. As we think about homelessness, there are disparities in who experiences homelessness that break down across age and gender and race. We know that pregnant women are highly vulnerable to becoming homeless, which puts their infants at great risk for either having miscarriages or their child being born but having poor outcomes, being put in the neonatal intensive care. So we have an infant born into homelessness with limited opportunities. We know that infants and young children are disproportionately experiencing homelessness. The greatest number of people experiencing homelessness by age, in fact, are these young children. As we enter into the preschool age, we know that there are many children who don't have access to safe childcare because they don't have a place to live. And so even as we see young children entering preschool and those type of settings, they're experiencing homelessness. As we enter the elementary school, homelessness continues to be an issue. Children have a hard time being connected with the transportation, the special services, and they're falling further and further behind their peers who are not homeless. As they enter into middle school, it's not only the loss of academic achievement and losing in that gap, but there also is the pressure that comes with being kind of the person who is looked to as being homeless, and those negative media stereotypes can cause a lot of stress and trauma for middle school students. And then as we move into the high school years, we're seeing many homeless students who are dropping out of high school, or they're in foster care and they're fleeing abusive situations. Disproportionately, LGBTQIA youth are entering homelessness. It's estimated that some 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQIA. They're fleeing intolerant situations, but actual abuse and other issues as well. Homelessness is an issue that, unlike the media coverage, impacts every child and children and youth of all ages, from infancy through high school and into the college years. So as we think about the future, I am working to elect a president who believes in and supports children, youth, and families, because we need a national federal government that is more supportive of the needs that the opening video laid out. First of all, we need investment in solutions. That is more housing. We need better access to education, including early learning, and access to healthcare, nutrition, and overall well-being. Without housing, we can't attain the education and the well-being that we want to see for all of our young people. We also need a president that's going to advance anti-racist policies and investments to really roll back the systemic racism in our community, across our country, that is resulting in a disproportionate number of African Americans experiencing homelessness. As we look for the long-term solutions of affordable housing with the types of services that support young people, we also need to protect them in the meantime. We need safe shelter for families with children, but we also need safe shelter for youth who are fleeing violent situations or who have left foster care settings or have aged out of foster care. And we need that to be a safe place where they can go about their business and get the kind of supports they need to get on with their life. We also need much more emergency aid. Right now, there are millions of Americans who are at risk of being evicted because they couldn't meet their August rent payments. And there is no federal program available to help these households avoid eviction. We know many children and youth will be harmed because we have a Congress that has failed to act to provide emergency aid. And then finally, I want a president who is really listening to children, who listens to youth and their parents, and is willing to take seriously all of the issues that they're bringing to the forefront about how they can have a better life and how they are going to be the future for our country. I encourage all of you to continue in this fight. It is in the long term. I got started on addressing homelessness when I was 24, and I looked around and I found that for the first time in our country, we were seeing increasing numbers of children and youth experiencing homelessness. Unfortunately, I'm still at it today. So as Martin Luther King says, the arc of justice is long and bends slowly. But I hope with your energy, you can really commit to ending homelessness among all people, but especially being focused on the really special needs of young people, children, and infants who are harmed for the lifetime when they become homeless. So thank you for letting me be a part of this, and look forward to working with you across the years.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for the work that you continue to do to find solutions to end homelessness. This is why we at the National Children's Campaign believe that we should have a U.S. Department of Children and Youth. We need a president for kids. And if you are eligible, vote for a president that supports children and youth.
If you're not eligible to vote, whether because you're too young or because you immigrated to the United States, you can talk to the people in your life and ask them to vote for a president who will support a U.S. Department for Children and Youth, and to vote for a president for kids. To get involved with National Children's Campaign, you can also apply at tinyurl.com/teamncc.
Please tune in to our series of panels happening all of this week that covers a variety of issues faced by America's 74 million children. Each day covers a different topic such as climate, education, poverty, child welfare, and immigration. The next panel will be tomorrow, Tuesday, August 18th at 1:30 p.m. Pacific Time or 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time about the impact of schools reopening during COVID-19. You won't want to miss it.
Thank you everyone for joining us. And you can check out the National Children's Campaign on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and LinkedIn, as well as at nationalchildrenscampaign.org. You can also visit voteforourfuture.org for more events, You can visit voteforafuture.org/vote as well as /events to see the rest of the events we'll be organizing for this week.
Thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you, everyone.